Good day and welcome to the Queer Pridecast. Today I'm joined by Jason Tan Liwag, who is a scientist, actor, writer, and curator. Jason programs films for Q Cinema and leads International Film Festival and has written for Rolling Stone Philippines, Still Story Life, Lifestyle Inquirer, and the now defunct CNN Philippines. He's with us today to talk about film and queer representation in film. So welcome, Jason.
I
Glad to
have
meet you
it's
again.
we tried recording this, like, for the disclosure of everyone who's listening. We tried to record this before. My internet was so bad. I am back, strong internet, a nice microphone. Hello.
Welcome to the Queer Podcast. Welcome back. So I'm gonna go straight to the point. Like obviously, like the hot topic right now is like Emilia Perez. Let's talk about it. Yeah, like it was in the Oscars. Like
Mm-hmm.
it got nominated for a lot of like awards and
Yeah.
all of the discourse around like representation and everything. So what do you think about it?
Oh my god. Okay, wait. So maybe it's very weird because, like, as a film critic or as someone who's just interested in films, we kind of track this over. For some people, maybe you hear about this film what, last month or so,
Mm,
maybe in early Feb or late January. But for me, I've heard about this since it premiered at Cannes.
mm,
Jacques Audiard is a really interesting filmmaker. He's already, I think, been at Cannes before for other films like The Prophet and everything. And like Katya Zamolodchikova, who's a very famous drag queen, said in their own podcast, like, it's a really fascinating, like, logline. It's essentially about
mm,
an owner of, like, a Mexican drug cartel who essentially transitions in and essentially chaos ensues after that, right?
mm.
And to be honest, like, my running joke around this is I blame Greta Gerwig because for all of this discussion, because Greta Gerwig was the one who handed the award of the
Mm,
best actress to all four of the women in Emilia Perez.
mm,
And as we know now, as people have seen now, like, there's a lot of controversy around it, right? Like, they're
mm,
beyond, like, even before Carlos Sofia Gascon's tweets around, like, Nazis and
mm,
other things, like, blew up. Like, it was already being lambasted, like, as something that was very anti-Mexican, something that was very anti-trans people. My favorite joke around the film is it feels like a film that someone just Googled what trans people were and decided to write something about it. It really brings to this larger, like, question, di ba? Na parang, what are these films even for? Like, I remember
mm,
Zoe Saldana, who won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. Like,
mm,
she was asked by, like, a Mexican critic, I think, or a journalist, na parang the Mexican people were quite angry about this film. What do you think about, what's your response to this? And then she essentially says something along the lines of, like, this is not a film that parang is about the Mexican people. It's an
mm,
allegory for the things that are happening in Russia, or something like that. But even then, right? Like, so why did you set it in Mexico? Like,
mm.
why use the trans body? Why?
Why not in France, right? I mean, they
Or
shot in France anyway, so.
and it really, like, yeah, interesting. I don't personally like the film as much.
Mm,
I think it's really experimental. I think that it takes a lot of big swings. Like, if you just look at, like, the filmmaking aspect of it, there are a lot of incredibly talented people
mm,
working on this, choreographers, production designers, editors. But it just feels like, as a whole film, like, it just feels misguided. It's like,
mm,
well, it's like a really nice book cover, but really, 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 really bad book. And I kind of can't help but think about what we were talking about before we came on this call, essentially,
mm,
which is, like, my main problem with the film is that a lot of the people who worked on it had essentially, like, brushed off all of this criticism, right?
mm,
Because they were saying that this is the first time that a story like this is getting to the world stage to a certain extent, right? It's
mm,
a film that is centered around the experiences, the transformative experiences of, like,
mm,
a trans woman, right? Whether or not she is depicted as a good woman at the beginning, or
mm,
whether she ends up being a good woman, is parang they don't necessarily see that that's relevant, right?
mm,
It brings into mind this, like, larger question around what are we looking for in the kinds of
mm,
queer people that we want to see. And
mm,
if there's so little queer work out there, like work by LGBTQIA plus people, does that mean that we should change the way we criticize things? Like Emilia Perez
Mm,
is probably one of the few major films from last year
mm,
at Cannes
mm.
that really featured or was centered around like at least to Jacques Audiard, the trans experience, right? So I do have some opinions about it, but I don't know. Did you get to watch the film?
I did, I did. It
What were
was a
your thoughts
very
about it?
it felt very conflicted, obviously, na,
Hmm.
I thought this is a problematic like trans woman.
Yeah,
But it also made me think na parang in terms of representation, like, is it a necessary film? Especially in the context of like what's happening in the US right now.
yeah,
Like trans rights are being rolled back, like, like the pushback of like against queer rights in the US. And I guess like we see this in other countries as well. So, which leads me to my question: like, do you think it's a necessary film with everything that's happening? Like, governments like pushing back against like diversity, equality, and inclusion, like pushing back against like queer people, like the rollback of rights. Was this necessary? Like, was this representation necessary? Stepping outside of like, I guess, controversial the film is, like maybe horrible the film is. Do you think this was something to like, I don't know, like necessary for us queer people, or do you think that this only like set us back as well, like in terms of like how like society sees queer people?
that's super interesting because this is a film that I think Jacques started to make even before the pandemic, if I'm right.
Mm-hmm.
It initially was created like as I think an opera, and then it was turned
Mm-hmm.
into a movie musical. And then because of the pandemic, there were certain delays associated with that, right? And so obviously, the world in which it was initially conceived and the
Mm-hmm.
world that it was released into is very, very different, right? Like, even
Mm-hmm.
if you say that, like, it was released, let's just say in 2022 when it was created,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
it's not, the world was so different then,
Mm-hmm.
we and I think that I don't necessarily know if whether the film is necessary or not. I incline to say that a lot of films are not necessary, and a lot of them, like, a lot of films are not necessary. They're not necessarily for food, they're not necessarily for like art, they're not necessary
Mm-hmm.
in terms of like representation, they're not even necessary to make money, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't, like, now the movie making industry is really like unsustainable. And so it also baffles me to a certain extent that, like, if a film is as not only offensive but also as just plainly bad
Mm-hmm.
as something like Emilia Perez, it really begs the question of why it was created in the first place. I do think that it the reason, but the thing is, like, we're also like two people who, understand at least some aspect of the trans
Mm-hmm.
experience, whether in proxy or through
Mm-hmm.
research or, through engaging with more media, right? But
Mm-hmm.
and this is something that also shocked me, was that, like, other people, like, I think that the film Emilia Perez is really not made for the communities that it purports to serve. I
Mm-hmm.
think it really panders to people who don't necessarily know this experience, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
a really, really brilliant article by a trans theorist named Paul Preciado. I think one of the,
Mm-hmm.
like, most brilliant, like, writers, and who created also a brilliant trans documentary experimental film called Orlando: My Political Biography.
Mm-hmm.
And he essentially released a document, like, criticizing Emilia Perez, like, as something that reduces, like, the trans experience to surgery, and it also flattens, like,
Mm-hmm.
even like life in Mexico to like these certain stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
It's essentially like an amalgamation of so many different stereotypes, right? And that should already alert us to, like, who it caters to. It
Yeah.
doesn't really cater to us, right? And it doesn't really
It
cater
caters to
to,
the cis hetero gaze, I would say. It's
yeah.
not for the queer people. Like it caters to like, yeah, like what you were saying, a
Yeah, and
different
that
type of audience.
and it, like, it begs this question, right? Like, there are many people that I really, really respect, like, really brilliant filmmakers who really love this film. If I'm right, Martin Scorsese loved this film. If
Mm,
I'm right,
okay.
Denis Villeneuve, Kate Blanchett loved this film. So that baffles me, you know.
Does that okay? Sorry. Does that say something about the? Because yeah, like Emilia Perez, like, it got a lot of nominations, diba? Like parang and people like
Everywhere. Yeah.
except I guess like queer people, like a lot of people celebrated this film, diba? Which is very interesting because like queer people are saying that it is problematic. Like trans people are saying it is problematic. But then again, like why do we see a lot of I guess like applause for the film?
I've been thinking a lot about that too, you know, and I think it really is tied to, apart from the fact that it panders to like communities that are supposedly triple, quadruple marginalized,
Mm,
you know, like layers of marginalization. It also like is created by very powerful people who you would not necessarily expect to pivot into these stories. You know, like Zoe
mm,
Saldana is like number 4 on the actors who have been in the most highest grossing films, I think, of all
mm,
time. And she essentially is like arguably like one of the most powerful Hollywood, you know,
mm,
celebrities, right? Jacques Audiard is essentially one of those kinds of directors who French people love to throw money at
mm.
in terms of productions, etc. Right? Selena Gomez, right, is a Disney star
Yeah.
who has, I think, one of the largest Instagram followings in the world, right?
If not the largest, I think.
I think she's either one or two, right? And then you have Carla Sofia Gascon, right? Who is up until, at least up until recently, right? Like one of the actress who has been like an underdog in, I
Mm,
think, Europe. I think based siya in Spain, if
mm.
I'm right. I'm not sure.
Spain, yeah.
Yeah. So all of those things, like they follow a certain narrative, right? Like these are powerful people who kind of come down, quote unquote, come down
Mm,
to like give us this kind of story, you know, and that in itself is some form of like artistic risk, and people like rewarding
mm,
artistic risk even if it is at the expense of people who are, you know, being marginalized, or
yeah.
for people who, you know, don't want to have any
Mm,
surgeries,
mm,
or even like are at the mercy of like the stereotypes around Mexican people, especially in the US, you know. So
mm.
I don't know, you know. That's one of the things that I'm thinking about. But I don't know. Do you see what I mean, or am I
Yeah, yeah, I
talking
do, I
out of my
do.
ass? Yeah.
But I wanna talk about like representation because I guess like that's the crux of your argument. Parang you see these people sort of like appropriating an experience that they have no idea of, which reminds me of like how films in the Philippines depicting queer people, maybe not recently, but like we've seen films like Dolphy's films, Roderick Paulatis films, like like how they depict queer people. In terms of representation, do you think those were helpful, those were necessary, or do you feel the same way na they set us back, like queer people didn't exactly benefit from the type of representation that these works offered to us?
You know what? That's really interesting because like the context of like Dolphy and Roderick Paulate and even Vice Ganda, no? Like
Mm,
even if that was only maybe a decade or two ago,
mm,
is so different from the context in which Emilia Perez is released, right? So Roderick Paulate and Dolphy really grew up in a time wherein queer people were essentially side characters, you know,
mm,
and they portrayed queer people for the first time on screen, even if they were, you know, not necessarily like part of the community, or at least
mm,
publicly so, you know. And essentially they allowed people, queer people, to essentially have some form of agency, you know. They weren't just window dressing.
mm,
And there's a really brilliant thesis around this called Bakla and the Silver Screen. So I feel like I might be flattening that because that's a like 300-page
mm,
dissertation. Essentially, those are one of the first movies that actually center these kinds of stories, right?
mm,
Whether it now, when we're looking at it from our perspectives, right, it's really problematic. But at the same time, before, for you to have such a project like that greenlit in the first place, it was almost impossible.
mm.
We have those discussions around like Brokeback Mountain, you know, like Brokeback
Yeah.
Mountain, they wanted other actors too for it, but other actors weren't willing to like create that kind of
Mm,
work, you know, because it'll risk their chances in Hollywood,
yeah.
etc. Right. So
Yeah.
in terms of like the material conditions, it's so different from before.
Mm,
But now we're at a point in history wherein everything is at the drop of your everything is at the
Mm.
mercy of your fingertips, right? Like you could
Mm.
Google or watch a series of
Mm.
documentaries, right, about trans people already, or even set up Zoom meetings with people from around the world. It's not
Mm.
as complicated as before. It's not as resource intensive as before. And
Mm.
so, and also, like, we're at the point wherein we know that before, when you were creating these things or these ideas of like what queer people were basing it on stereotypes, whether or not they were exposed to queer people at all, right?
Mm.
And that was because only studios had the resources to actually create these images.
Mm.
But with the democratization of filmmaking, because now everything could be digital, you could shoot a phone like Tangerine
Mm.
on an
Yeah.
iPhone,
Yeah.
right? That meant essentially that queer people have started to essentially have started to tell their own stories, and that
Mm.
wasn't possible before. And maybe part of the reason why I am personally so, I'm not, it's not that I absolutely, absolutely hate Emilia Perez, because I think I'm closer to indifference towards it.
Mm. Mm.
But if there is a reason that I hate it a lot, apart from my qualms about the film, is that I think it really takes oxygen away from really interesting works by queer trans
Mm.
artists from around the world.
Mm.
These are just powerful people who are, to a certain extent, not necessarily pandering for an Oscar, but
Mm.
pandering for an Oscar. Where are the other, like, the queer animated works?
Mm.
The there are a set of non-binary Singaporean filmmakers who are making interesting animated work around their relationships. Like,
Mm.
where are the articles on that?
Mm.
And partly why, what scares me though also is that um I feel like a lot of people like to talk negatively about Emilia Perez, because it's also much easier to hate on, like,
Mm.
a trans woman. Both things can be true, right? She could be a
Yeah.
horrible person, and at the same time, we have all of these biases that make things easier. Yeah. So to go back to your question, Evan, I'm not very articulate right now, but
Mm.
essentially, I think that the material conditions wherein Dolphy created the works, right, means that those works emerged like, flowers from cement, right? But now
Mm.
we're in fertile soil. Like, there are
Mm.
many, many other examples of stories from trans and queer people that center trans and queer experiences or not. And those
Mm.
aren't getting the same air or funding because Emilia Perez is here taking up all of that oxygen.
In the Philippines, would you say na stories about queer people are becoming more rich or more, I guess, like less flat? Like, how would you use the term, diba? Like, parang it's less caricaturish, like less stereotypical, but more of like really exploring different dimensions of like queer people. Would you say that that has been developing in that way, like changing positively, or no?
I think there are more. There are a lot of young filmmakers who are making stories about their own experiences.
Hmm.
I think one of my favorite films from last year that centered around trans people was part of Q Cinema. Sorry, it's not a
Hmm.
plug. It's just that it really was. It's called Rampage. Essentially, it's a short film. It's created by Kukay Bautista Sinampan, who is a
Hmm.
brilliant non-binary artist and queer image world maker. Parang
Hmm.
yun yung description niya sa sarili niya. And essentially, they created, along with a bunch of trans folks, that they are part of, like, a
Hmm.
theater film community in Antipolo. A story about how young kids in future Philippines, if they're discovered that they're trans, they're taxidermied and turned into saints,
Hmm.
essentially. And then they're paraded around as a warning to people who are thinking of transitioning. And it
Hmm.
follows these three queer folks who are essentially trying to retrieve the body of one of their
Hmm.
sisters during the parade. And I really love that film because it's sci-fi, it's action, it's funny at certain points, but really heartbreaking at certain points.
Hmm.
And those kinds of stories have recently received, funding.
Mm.
interest, backing. But then I'm also speaking from the lens of like Imperial Manila, you know?
Yeah.
And like when I listen to like other queer like storytellers outside of maybe the occasional grant, like
Mm.
occasional short film grant, like the larger studios, they don't necessarily want to risk a lot of money in queer
Mm.
artists. I mean,
Mm.
the BL movement was so short lived, and that in itself, right? Like that could have opened so many
Yeah.
other doors related to other forms of like representation, but
Mm.
that's to a certain extent not really died, but it's died
Mm.
down. And
Mm.
yeah, so I think that there are more people willing to create. Definitely. There are more people who are willing to turn the lens to themselves and to their friends
Mm.
and other people. But whether or not like the big studios that are making a lot of investments want to invest in that, I don't
Mm.
necessarily think so, which is sad,
Mm.
because
Yeah.
I know you know this, especially, but representation is to a certain extent important because it allows people to create and to
Mm.
live, right? I think those are my interests when it comes to talking about this.
Mm.
So yeah, I'm just sad that people aren't being given money, even if these are
Yeah.
like interesting concepts. Lots of people are willing to back it. There's an established
Mm.
audience.
No,
It's
yeah,
sad.
interesting. You mentioned BL series, like all of the works that were created around like boys love. Would
Yeah.
you say na parang those were more of a novelty? Like parang people were bored, like they wanted new things, and now they have moved on, and like suddenly na parang okay, like now that it basically was just like a fad rather than like a marker of like real progress where people are starting to become more open to like queer stories or like realizing that how rich the experiences of queer people are.
I actually think that a lot of people would be more open to creating BLs
Mm.
if like the ad industry had not started blacklisting people from who participated in BL. So yeah, so essentially like you get a call sheet and then it says there, I won't say the particular brands, but I know this is an actual phenomenon because it's confirmed by a bunch of people in the ad industry and others, right? If you're part of like a BL or if you're part of a Viva Max film, you're automatically like not eligible for like certain commercials, right? So
Mm.
because these big commercials are supposed to be family friendly,
Yeah.
and maybe these people are afraid essentially of your child googling
Alienated.
this actor
Yeah.
and then finding them kissing someone or whatever.
Mm.
And to me, that's really dumb because these people are actors,
Yeah. Yeah.
and intimacy is kind of at the core of so many experiences about
Mm.
humans, right?
Mm.
But yeah, I do think that it was a novelty because people started not investing in it, or at least actors started to be afraid that like big brand deals would like
Mm.
be taken away from them. I know this also because Topper Fabregas was part of a Viva Max film, I think it was Table for Three, wherein he was in a throuple, right?
Mm.
And I think one of the ads rescinded their offer to him. And I think he was very public about this.
Mm.
I think it's in one of his highlights for his reels. But yeah,
Yeah.
but that's sad, right? Because essentially like, actors have to make money. But even if they are willing to risk some aspect of like it even if they
Mm.
are willing to some aspect of their career, or maybe even if they're just allies, they can't necessarily appear in material that positively represents people because their livelihood can be taken away from them. And
Mm.
so, yeah, it bleeds into this whole cycle of
Yeah.
certain things.
Interesting, like you mentioned earlier, diba, making money and also
Yeah.
like mainstream cinema, like not being ready for a lot of like you were talking, diba, the parang independent cinema, like really exploring like different dimensions of the queer experience. But we don't see, or well, correct me if I'm wrong, but do you see this translating to mainstream cinema? Like recently, Vice Ganda had the Metro Manila Film Festival entry, and like it's centered around the family. So like there's still that dimension, like yes, this is a queer person, but like, look how family oriented this queer person is. Like, do you think that's the case? Like, when it comes to mainstream cinema trying to tackle queer stories, like they have to frame it in a way that I guess is still quote unquote acceptable for a mainstream audience.
That's interesting because to a certain extent, that is dictated creatively by people behind the scenes.
Mm,
So the more, for example, right, like if you have anything that's R18,
mm,
SM Cinemas won't screen you, if I'm
mm,
right. And I don't necessarily know the policy behind that, but
mm.
I think it's also because that makes sense for them on a financial level
Yeah.
because,
It
you
limits the
know,
audience.
yeah, it limits the audience, right? And so the goal for many, many, many films in the Philippines, especially even like, as you said, queer work, right, is to be PG. But for you to be PG, you sanitize so many things, right? For
Mm,
you to get to that rating. Sometimes even like a kiss automatically makes you go up to R13, right?
mm.
Which is kind of crazy because people see kiss all the time on the
Yeah, like
streets,
straight
diba?
people kiss all the time.
Diba? And even in commercials, so like really doesn't make a lot. It ties back to this larger question of censorship too, and at the same time, like the finance aspect of it. So it's this negative feedback loop, right? We don't see queer people, or we don't see queer people, we don't see trans people in mainstream cinema. And so we think they don't exist. And so we don't clamor for them. And then when we do clamor for them, there's so much pressure that's built on that whether they financially succeed or not becomes a huge issue.
Mm,
But for, John Lloyd Cruz hasn't had straight box office successes all the time.
mm.
Catherine Bernardo has not had straight box office hits all the time. Um, well, nowadays she does, but that's a different
Mm,
thing altogether. But people are given chances, and queer people and trans people don't necessarily get those same chances.
yeah. So, in terms of, you were talking about like looking at the material conditions of when the film was created.
Yeah.
Going back to Dolphy and Roderick Paulati, do you think that we should be more forgiving when reviewing, like, like when assessing how queer people were represented by their films because of the material conditions? Or should we be more critical? As a film critic, like, do you think
Oh my
na
God.
there is you can make an allowance for that, like, and sort of justify na, oh, this is how they depicted queer people, but this is because of the time that they were in.
Yeah. I think it's both. I think that
Mm,
you can see it from the vantage point of the past, like we were all, even something that was created like 10 years ago,
mm,
it won't necessarily age well.
mm,
And I don't necessarily think that today is any better, like
mm.
I mean, there's still quote unquote shitty representation. Am I allowed to curse? Sorry.
Yeah, yeah, it's
Yeah. Sorry, I just realized like there's still shitty representation now, and there's
mm,
still shitty films that have good representation,
yeah.
right? Or there's still shitty films with shitty representation. So
Mm,
I think that we shouldn't necessarily we have to tether ourselves to the past, right? Like
mm,
I think Michaela Cole frames this really, really, really nicely. That she created a show called "I May Destroy You," right? And
yeah. I love
chewing
that.
gum, and yeah, me too. I love the show. And in one of the, I think, BBC interviews, she essentially said that for you to create a story that was centered around Black people 50 years ago, it would have been insane. Like it would have
Mm,
been impossible, or it would have been so difficult to finance. But nowadays that is happening. And I think there's a certain level of like, yes, we want to have as much as we can. And there is a certain level of impatience that keeps us moving forward. But then
mm,
there's also, because we're so impatient about moving forward, we're also not acknowledging like all of the different forms of progress that we're already
mm,
making.
mm,
There are many ways that we are also regressing. I do think that to a certain extent, a lot of the films from the 70s were um, much more radical than a lot of the films
mm,
nowadays. Because nowadays, for you to get into the cinemas themselves, there are so many more rules.
mm,
Tubog, tubog sa ginto, tubog ng ginto,
mm,
were films that were made in the 70s, 60s, that were brilliant, and they were progressive, and they were challenging all of these different things. They hold up. But we don't necessarily have access to all of them, right? They're not necessarily shown in schools.
Yeah.
And so it goes back to this like larger question of forgetting. Like I do think we can, I do think we have to remember what the progress was from before,
Mm.
but I don't necessarily also believe that we should forgive, because if we're just understanding of all of these things, it also runs the risk of like repeating these same mistakes.
Mm.
I'm not a firm believer that, we need another Dolphy now. I think
Mm.
Dolphy
Yeah.
emerged as a figure because of the material conditions that he was
Mm.
situated in also. So yeah, I think it's a remember but not to forgive.
Mm. Well, interesting din na parang, I can't remember where I exactly read this, but I remember that they were saying na, like there's a tendency for us because of a different, I guess, like moral realities that we have right now. We frame like experiences from the past according to how we perceive it right now. But at the same time, like we do not acknowledge na, yeah, they were a product of their time. Like obviously they had a lot of pushback. Like, I would assume like queer people like 100 years ago never really experienced the way um we live right now. But at the same time, like there's that dimension of a lot of definitions that we have like didn't exist even before. So parang di ba like parang you can't like parang retrofit your experiences to another experiences. So yeah, really interesting. But would you say that like queer artists in the Philippines, like queer filmmakers in the Philippines, like, are they trying to sort of well, we have like June Lana who has been creating really good like queer films, right? So would you say na parang we have more of that, I guess, like queer people like owning queer stories and like presenting them in the way that queer people want to be seen?
That's so interesting because I was on the set of like a June Lana film recently, and he's really wonderful. The whole team around him is really wonderful. But I think that even June acknowledges this, that the problem nowadays, and this is obviously in like from film to TV to business to like
Mm,
economics and politics, like there are just so many huge extremes. So, June could make a film, right? Can essentially make a film nowadays, and that could earn some form of money,
mm,
or that could get a seed grant from something like
yeah.
Netflix or Amazon. I'm not saying
Mm,
that he actually got these things, but I'm saying that
yeah,
he's
yeah,
out of all of the filmmakers nowadays, people would likely trust him, right? Because he
yeah.
has a
He has
good
a
track
fighting
record,
chance.
right?
Yeah.
But, you know, the younger filmmakers, the emerging filmmakers, for them to actually create their first work, you know, that's not necessarily possible nowadays.
Mm,
The other day I was looking at Marilu Diaz-Abaya. Marilu Diaz-Abaya's Moral was her fifth film. She had made four other films before that, and she was
mm,
only 27. And
mm,
that was insane to me, right? And obviously, like, Marilu is like, that was in the 70s and it was so different. But nowadays, for there to become like a Broca or an Ishmael Bernal or like Mario O'Hara or, any number of filmmakers, right? You don't know, like, you don't necessarily see them. I'll say
mm,
something also about Cinemalaya, because
mm,
there are rumors floating around, and I don't know anything, but there are things that I'm seeing around that this might be the last edition of this
mm,
current, at least, iteration of Cinemalaya, right? I don't have any, like, no one has said anything to me necessarily. But
mm.
I, and that's really sad because that's one of the places wherein a lot of interesting queer work was
Yeah,
created that really challenged this idea of, that's where Pagdadalaga ni Maximo Oliveros
yeah,
was
yeah.
produced, like how many years ago? I think 20 years ago, and many other films, right? I think even Fuckboys was like Cinemalaya,
Mm,
di ba? And so that in itself brings into this larger question, right? Like while people in France are making Emilia Perez, we're here, and people who are in Mexico and many other places around the world, right, are struggling to make like these mid-budget to even low-budget films
mm.
that are actually like anchored in their communities. And it's really sad, right? It's really, really, really sad.
I don't want to end this
Yeah, we shouldn't. We
episode
should.
on a sad note. Any interesting queer films that people should watch out for coming out like a couple of months?
My God, that's so difficult. I'm a firm believer that if you are, Stanley Tucci
Mm,
is not part of the queer community, like, but we love him in Devil Wears Prada and the like,
mm,
right? Stanley Tucci was always going to get those roles. Like it
mm,
wasn't going to go to another queer person.
mm.
But I'm a firm believer that if you are like an ally, I think it's okay for, there's just an inequity in
Yeah.
terms of like the opportunities, right? But the acting itself, like
Mm.
even queer people should be able to portray
Sorry,
straight roles.
last
Yeah, go,
I said it was the last question, but I just remembered. Did you like
go.
Queer? Like the film Queer? Have you
I
seen?
did, but I found it quite weird.
That was the same thing. Like I liked the first half, and then the second half felt, I don't know, like felt
Yeah, but that
weird.
was
Like I guess
very
weird is the
accurate to Burroughs's like journals, I think.
yeah.
And then to a certain extent, like Luca changed it significantly. But yeah, I think that yeah, even something like queer, right? Like, I really like the questions, Evan, because it begs this larger question, right? Like, queerness and transness, there are things that generally, they have existed in the peripheries of like
Yeah.
the dominant culture, right? And when you bring them into like mainstream, when you bring them to the center, these discussions, there will be some necessary pushback, right?
Mm,
And resistance. And B, something will get lost in the translation of those, not necessarily not only those experiences but also those narratives when you talk about them. And so i i i I am also always resistant of the question of should things be in the mainstream. I think things should get paid for. I think that
mm,
people deserve to tell their stories, but I don't necessarily expect like Star Cinema or GMA Pictures to like feature heavily like a trans story or
mm,
because maybe even if you present a trans story through that lens, it might get flattened to a way that it's
mm.
not really representative
Yeah.
of the trans experience itself even.
Mm.
But that's not necessarily for me to decide, that's for other people to decide. But for interesting queer work, that's so hard. Oh my God, what am I thinking? There's always interesting short films from the Philippines around
Mm,
queer work. It's not yet in production, I think, but they're in pre-production. There's a really great film by Wami Alcazaren. It's a nice script.
mm,
I forgot the title. It has noodles in the title. And
mm,
essentially it's not to give anything away, but it's
mm,
about two queer boys in a dystopic world trying to find some form of salvation.
mm,
And that is always interesting. I think actually more than anything for me, it's really about following like trans, non-binary, queer
mm.
like artists. So
Yeah.
probably I really love Wami Alcazaren. I really love Kukay Zinampan. I love Celeste Lapida's work. Oh my
Mm.
God, brilliant work, brilliant, brilliant.
And I just
Yeah.
remember they're doing animation, like a film on Sasha Saturna again, right? Like they're in
Yes,
production.
yes, and that one is animated. That's really
Mm.
cool. I think si Avid, I forgot his
Yung
name. I
Goren, yeah,
forgot
I
his
think so, yeah.
Ilonggoren, yes. And then Junlana has Die Beautiful the musical, so that there's gonna be a
Interesting. Mm,
musical about that. So that's cool. But beyond that, there are actually really cool queer artists from the regions as well. I feel like I will just give you a letterbox list of these
okay.
things. But yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think of one right now and I'm blanking. I'm so sorry.
No worries. Like we'll link that after. Like I'll
Thank
add it
you.
in the description. But yeah, thank you, Jason. This was a really interesting episode, and I feel like we can talk more about like, the future of queer cinema in the Philippines, and
My
also like
God.
how we see like representation across the world. But thank you, and I hope to see you again soon.
See you again, Evan. Bye.